Soviet tank crews in Afghanistan once joked that nothing the Mujahideen carried could pierce their steel. For years, that swagger appeared unshakable until an invisible force began ripping apart tanks from ridgelines miles away, leaving only burnt wrecks and unanswered questions. This is the moment Soviet invincibility was shattered by a weapon few saw coming. The brutal truth about how an unthinkable shift in the war changed everything runs far deeper than most ever realized. What exactly destroyed the myth of armored supremacy? Convoys wound through the Afghan mountains with a kind of practiced arrogance. Soviet tank crews sealed inside T-62 and T-55 tanks felt untouchable behind layers of steel and the thunder of their engines. The routine was almost ritual. Lead the column, keep the hatches down, trust the armor. In memoirs, tankers described themselves as kings of the road, rolling through dust and rock, while rifle fire and the occasional rocket-propelled grenade rattled harmlessly off their hulls. The infantry on foot, they joked, were the ones who needed luck. One crewman wrote, "We moved like a steel fist. Afghan fighters could only watch us pass." Every patrol followed the same script. Tanks led the way, engines echoing off the canyon walls, while supply trucks and armored personnel carriers trailed in their wake. The Mujahideen, armed mostly with small arms and old rocket-propelled grenades, were seen as little more than an annoyance. Soviet doctrine called for mechanized power to control the valleys, and the tankers believed it. Their confidence was not just bravado, it was earned through years of surviving ambushes that never seemed to do more than scratch the paint. Inside those tanks, the world was noise and vibration, but also a sense of certainty. Crews kept their routines tight, trusting in their armor and their training. A veteran recalled, "We rolled like kings, laughing at the idea that anything could touch us." The landscape belonged to them, at least in their minds. The mountains and passes were obstacles to overcome, not threats to fear. For nearly a decade, the armored columns moved with swagger, convinced that nothing in Afghanistan could challenge the invincible steel fist of the Red Army. Soviet regimental doctrine in Afghanistan rested on a single, unshakable idea. Whoever controlled the roads controlled the war. Armored columns were the backbone of this strategy. Tanks, armored personnel carriers, and supply trucks moved in tight formations along narrow highways that threaded through the mountains. Every mile of road was mapped, scheduled, and guarded. Soviet manuals outlined strict convoy timetables and spacing, minimizing risk from mines and ambushes, but keeping the routes predictable. The regimental command saw mobility as their greatest asset. Tanks were not just weapons, they were symbols of presence. A column rolling through the Salang Pass or the Gardez Kost Road was meant to reassure Soviet-held towns and intimidate anyone watching from the hills. The logistical lifeline stretched from Kabul to outposts in the eastern valleys. Fuel, ammunition, and food moved in rigid cycles, all under the protection of heavy armor. Infantry and engineers cleared the way, but it was the tanks that set the pace and the tone. Convoy schedules were posted in garrison offices and radioed ahead, sometimes days in advance. The assumption was simple: as long as the armored fist kept moving, the enemy would never gain a foothold. Regimental memos from the early 1980s emphasized speed and shock. Columns were to push through ambush zones with minimal delay, trusting in firepower and discipline to break up any attack. This reliance on mechanized mobility shaped every aspect of the Soviet presence. Patrols rarely strayed from the main roads, and support units were trained to expect protection from the tanks at the head of every column. The landscape dictated the routes, but doctrine dictated the tempo. Predictable roads became the arteries of control, and the belief in their safety was as institutional as it was personal. For years, this system delivered results. Supply lines held, and the valleys remained under the shadow of Soviet steel. Midway through the war, a new kind of incident began to haunt Soviet convoys. Tanks at the front of the column would vanish in a sudden eruption. No warning, no visible enemy, just a plume of smoke and twisted steel. Crews called these events ghost hits. Veterans recall the confusion. One moment the lead T-62 was crawling forward, the next the turret was gone and the road ahead was blocked by burning wreckage. There was no flash from the valley floor, no telltale arc of an RPG. Instead, a thin smoke trail sometimes flickered high above the convoy, too fast and distant to trace. Reports filtered back to regimental headquarters describing tanks struck from nowhere, with survivors unable to agree on what had happened. Some blamed mines or sabotage, but the damage was too precise. Armor pierced clean through, interiors gutted by a focused blast. Rumors spread quickly through the ranks. Crews began to whisper about a weapon that could kill from beyond sight, guided by an invisible hand. The term ghost hit became shorthand for these unexplained losses, fueling anxiety in every armored unit. Commanders demanded answers, but even after-action reports could only offer speculation. One anonymous crewman wrote that they saw a streak in the sky, then nothing, just fire where the tank had been. The sense of safety inside those steel walls began to crack. Each new patrol was shadowed by the possibility that the next explosion would come without warning from an enemy no one could see. The search for an explanation had begun, but for the tankers on the ground, it felt like the rules of survival were being rewritten in real time. A single TOW missile launch begins with a soft hiss, barely audible above the wind. The operator, crouched behind the tripod, eyes fixed on the crosshairs, tracks a distant tank crawling through the valley below. This is not a point-and-shoot weapon. The TOW tube, launched optically tracked wire-guided, demands patience and steady hands. As the trigger is squeezed, the missile leaps from the tube and unfolds its wings, trailing a thin wire behind it. For the next 10 to 20 seconds, the operator must keep the crosshairs perfectly aligned with the moving target. Every twitch, every breath matters. The guidance system, known as SACLOS, interprets these tiny adjustments, sending corrections down the wire at lightning speed. The missile's flight is not a straight line. It zigzags in the air, a pattern created by the infrared tracker and the trailing guidance wire, which can stretch out to 3 kilometers before it snaps. This wire is almost invisible from the ground, glinting only if the sun catches it just right. Soviet crews never saw it coming. They looked for muzzle flashes or RPG arcs, but the TOW launch was masked by distance and terrain. By the time the missile reached its target, often from over a mile away, the tank crew had no warning at all. Inside the launcher, the electronics are simple but effective. The operator's job is to keep the sight on the tank, while the system calculates every correction and relays them instantly through the wire. There are no fancy onboard computers in the missile itself, just a beacon at the tail and small actuators responding to the operator's aim. This allowed Mujahideen teams to set up on ridgelines, wait for hours as convoys crawled through the valley, and then strike with surgical precision. One Mujahideen veteran described it simply: patience. You watch them crawl, and when the time is right, you strike invisibly. The result was a new kind of battlefield math. The tanker's armor and routines meant little against an enemy who could kill from beyond sight, guided by a wire as thin as a thread. Afghanistan's mountains carved the battlefield into narrow corridors, dictating every move an armored convoy could make. The Kabul to Jalalabad Highway, a lifeline for Soviet supply lines, twisted through steep valleys and sheer rock faces. Elevation differences between the road and surrounding ridgelines often stretched more than 1,000 meters, creating natural vantage points that overlooked every bend and choke point. Tanks and trucks, forced to hug the road, became moving targets, predictable and exposed. Topographic surveys from the period mapped these passes in detail. The main routes snaked through valleys where the only way forward was to follow the asphalt, hemmed in by cliffs and loose scree. Convoys crawling through these bottlenecks had no room to maneuver. The geography that once shielded them from small arms fire now worked against them. Each ridgeline became a potential firing position, invisible to the crews below, but perfectly placed for long-range weapons. The TOW missile had a range of up to 3 kilometers, which allowed Mujahideen teams to set up far above the road, beyond the reach of Soviet machine guns or even tank cannons. Operators waited on slopes with clear lines of sight, often for hours, tracking columns as they inched along the valley floor. The missile's wire guidance meant that even at these distances, a patient operator could guide a shot directly into a tank's vulnerable side or rear armor. Maps from the era highlight these kill zones, tight corners, blind ascents, and narrow bridges where convoys slowed to a crawl, unable to disperse or accelerate. The result was a battlefield defined not by firepower, but by terrain. Soviet doctrine had not anticipated a weapon that could turn the high ground into a fortress. Each pass became an ambush arena where the advantage belonged to whoever controlled the ridgeline, not the road. For the tank crews below, every kilometer brought a new sense of vulnerability, and every mountain pass became a place where steel and confidence could vanish in a single flash. Tank crews once joked about the infantry's nerves, but after the first unexplained strikes, the humor vanished. Inside the armored hulls, routines frayed. Crews who used to trust the thickness of their steel now spent every kilometer on edge, eyes darting to the ridgelines, searching for the faintest glint or any unnatural movement. The nickname spread quickly: wire-guided nightmare. It was not just a weapon, it was a rumor that crept into every conversation in the barracks and every whispered exchange during maintenance checks. One gunner in a T-62 described the change in his diary. "We used to scan the road for mines. Now we watch the mountains, waiting for a flash that means death." Another crewman wrote, "I counted every bend, every shadow. The ridges felt alive and every rock was an enemy." The act of closing the hatch, which once brought a sense of safety, now felt like sealing yourself inside a trap. Some tank commanders began ordering the hatches left cracked open, desperate for a faster escape if the worst happened. Rumors outpaced the official briefings. Stories circulated of entire crews lost in an instant, of tanks that burned from the inside out without warning. Veterans spoke of the silence before a strike, the way the world seemed to hold its breath, then erupted in chaos. At night, the mess halls grew quieter and the laughter was forced. Base chaplains saw more visitors. Memorials for lost crews became part of the daily landscape, reminders that the next patrol could be the last. The psychological toll was impossible to ignore. Even the most seasoned crews, men who had survived years of ambushes and mines, admitted to fear. One commander summed it up: "We rolled like kings until the horizon killed us." The invulnerability that once defined Soviet armor was gone, replaced by a dread that clung to every patrol and shadowed every mile of mountain road. Late 1986 brought a new kind of terror to the valley roads. Tanks struck by TOW missiles were destroyed mid-maneuver, giving crews only seconds to react. One survivor from a Jalalabad convoy described the chaos. He said, "We saw a flash from the ridge, then the turret filled with fire. The driver screamed and I reached for the hatch. Everything behind me was burning. In those moments, routine dissolved into panic. Hatches jammed, radios went silent, and the only choice was to bail out or risk being trapped inside a furnace." After-action reports from 1987 listed multiple tanks lost in a single ambush, with crews caught mid-turn or reversing, unable to outpace a missile tracking their every move. The sense of control vanished. Veterans recalled the smell of burning paint, the roar of ammunition cooking off, and the shock of seeing comrades disappear in an instant. The battlefield was no longer a place for swagger. It was a place where seconds decided who lived and who vanished. Workshops in Kabul and regimental depots across the valleys became laboratories for desperation. Mechanics welded spare track links onto turret sides, stacked sandbags along the hulls, and bolted makeshift steel cages to the armor, hoping to blunt the next missile. Maintenance logs from 1987 detail repeated attempts to retrofit T-62s with these field modifications, sometimes within hours of returning from a patrol. Yet the results were grim. TOW missiles striking from 2 kilometers away ignored these stopgaps, and copper jets sliced through sandbags and shattered welded cages as easily as bare armor. A maintenance officer later recalled that they could stack sandbags all day, but the missile didn't care. Convoy routes shifted, detouring around known kill zones. The geography offered no real options. Every road was overlooked by high ground. Requests for reactive armor outpaced supply, and crew briefings grew longer, filled with warnings rather than solutions. Each failed fix deepened the sense that the problem was not just tactical, but fundamental. By 1988, the roads that once defined Soviet control had become liabilities. Convoy logs from the Kabul to Jalalabad and Gardez to coast highways show a sharp drop in armored movements. Supply runs that once rolled daily now stalled for weeks at a time. In some sectors, entire arteries were abandoned, left to the dust and the watchful eyes on the ridgelines. Tanks, once the spearhead of every operation, were pulled from the front of columns and relegated to rear guard or static defense. Regimental memos from the final year of the war urged commanders to avoid exposed routes, and new orders prioritized infantry screens and helicopter cover over mechanized advances. Western defense analysts studying these shifts concluded that the Soviets surrendered the initiative. Armor no longer led. It followed, and sometimes it did not follow at all. The operational model that had carried the Red Army deep into Afghanistan was dismantled in the span of months, undone not by numbers, but by the certainty that every mountain pass could hide a wire-guided shot that would never be seen until it was too late. Today, precision-guided weapons like the TOW shape every armored conflict, from Ukraine to the Middle East, and they force even superpowers to rethink battlefield dominance. The myth of invincibility now dies at the push of a button, not against another tank, but from a distant ridge. In modern war, the smallest team with the right tool can change history's course. What will be the next weapon that rewrites the rules?